Today I want to share with you how to make 5 healthy make-ahead mixes to stock your pantry. These are all shelf stable, and I'm going to show you how to make a pancake mix, a cornbread mix, a brownie mix, a biscuit mix, and number 5 is an all-purpose baking mix that's a perfect substitute for Bisquick. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel. And don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Well, all these healthy make-ahead mixes rely on using some whole grain flour. Now, because we are using some whole grain flour, the shelf stability of these mixes is 6 months. If you decide to substitute and use all-purpose flour, some of you may know it as plain flour or white flour, or bread flour for that matter, then the shelf stability of these would be 1 year. And when I say shelf stable, I mean that these can actually go into your main pantry or your extended pantry. They do not need to be refrigerated or frozen. But if you want to do that, you certainly can, and that would extend the shelf life. Now I'm going to go over all the ingredients for each of these make-ahead mixes, but don't worry, you don't need to write any of this down. Underneath this video, if you open up the description, there'll be a link. It'll say recipe, and there'll be a link next to that. And if you click on it, it'll take you over to my website, and you can read all of the ingredients online, or you can print it out. Also, in each recipe, I will tell you how to take this mix and turn it into what it's intended for. So we're going to start with the pancake mix. So I'll have the list of ingredients for your make-ahead mix, and then I'll also include a recipe for how to turn your make-ahead mix into pancakes, or into the cornbread, or into the brownies, and so on and so forth. Now I want to let you know these are completely dry mixes. You may see some make-ahead mixes that add in the fat, and I'm not going to do that, because adding in the fat, even if it's a relatively shelf-stable fat like a coconut oil or like lard, the problem is when you're making a make-ahead mix with whole grains, letting them be exposed to the moisture that is in those fats will lower the shelf life. So if you go ahead at this point and add in your coconut oil or add in your lard, then you're probably going to push the shelf life of these mixes closer to 3 months versus 6 months. So what I prefer to do is keep them completely dry, and then when I get ready to make whatever it is, whatever mix I'm using and whatever I'm making with it, at that point, I like to add in my fat and my liquids. Now what I'm showing here today, for my whole grain flour, I'm using whole wheat flour because that's the easiest flour for most of us to find at the grocery store. However, if you want to upgrade it and use one of the ancient grains, like a whole grain spelt flour or a whole grain einkorn flour, you can certainly do that. Also, to some of these make-ahead mixes, I do add in a little all-purpose flour, and that just helps lighten the mixture overall. But never feel bad about mixing in a little all-purpose flour with your whole grain flours, because even our ancestors would lighten their whole grain flour by sifting out a little of the bran and the germ. So we basically imitate that process by just adding a little all-purpose flour to help lighten our whole grain flour. Since most of us are buying the whole grain flour from the store, we're not grinding it and sifting it. So in order to replicate something like what our ancestors did, we add in a little all-purpose flour. However, that said, if you have a grain mill and you're grinding your grain and you're making your whole grain flour, you can simply sift out a little bit of the bran and the germ, and then you can just proceed from there without adding in any all-purpose flour. And I will definitely explain all of that and go through all of that in the written recipe. And one other thing I want to mention is if you are not grinding your own grain, but you're using an ancient grain, maybe a whole grain spelt or a whole grain einkorn, and you do want to lighten it a little, you can certainly use your all-purpose spelt flour or your all-purpose einkorn flour in place of the traditional all-purpose flour, which is a wheat-based flour, a modern-day wheat-based flour that's most commonly found at the grocery store. Well, let's start with our make-ahead pancake mix. What you're going to need is 3½ cups of a whole grain flour. As I said, I have whole wheat flour, 100% whole wheat flour, and I'm just using the whole wheat flour. You may also see at your grocery store something that's becoming more common now called white whole wheat flour. And that's not all-purpose flour, that's actually a whole grain flour, just from a slightly different breed of wheat. And that does create a slightly lighter baked good. But so if you find that, you can certainly use that as well. But I've just got your traditional 100% whole wheat, the common whole wheat from the grocery store, 3½ cups. And then I've got 1 cup of all-purpose flour or plain flour. Next, you're going to want 2½ tablespoons of baking powder. And the baking powder that I've got here is an aluminum-free baking powder. And next you're going to need 1/2 tablespoon of salt. And I'm using a fine ground sea salt. Whatever salt you use, you can use the pink Himalayan salt, you can use the real salt, you can even use table salt if that's what you have. But you want, whatever you use, you want to make sure that it's a fine ground salt so that it mixes well. And then you need 1/4 cup of some type of dry sweetener. I'm using sucanat, which is simply the dried sugar cane juice, so it has all the vitamins and minerals still in it, as opposed to white sugar, where those vitamins and minerals have been stripped out. And if you're not familiar with sucanat, it sometimes is sold under that name, sucanat, which stands for sugar cane natural. It's just a little compilation of the letters from those 3 words. And sometimes it'll just be sold under the name dried sugar cane juice. That's one option. You could use maple sugar, you could use date sugar, you could use coconut sugar, any sugar you like. Certainly in a pinch, if you're still in the transition of transitioning from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and all you have is white sugar, you can still use that at this point. And you're just going to need 1/4 cup. Now you just want to get a whisk, wooden spoon, spatula, whatever you have, and you want to get this really well incorporated so that everything is thoroughly mixed together. And just keep twirling it around until you see that sugar blending in. That's probably the easiest thing for you to see blend in because it's a little darker color. Then once you get this all mixed up, you just want to transfer it to whatever you want to store it in. And I'm going to just store it in a canning jar. And this is a 1/2 gallon canning jar, so I should have plenty of room to get all of this in there. Once I get this into my jar, I like to put in a little silica gel pack. And I'll just put that right down in there, and that'll help keep this very dry. And those silica gel packs are very helpful, especially if you live in a humid climate. So that's just a little tip to keep in mind. And you can pretty much find those anywhere. They're always usually available online at Amazon. I'll put a link in the description below to the ones that I like. But just keep your eyes open. Sometimes you'll find them at the big box stores or somewhere maybe around the canning area in your grocery store. So definitely keep your eyes open. But those are great at making sure that your mixtures stay nice and dry. But don't worry if you don't have them. It's fine. They're still going to hold up well. Now when you're ready to use this, you'll mix this with your milk and your eggs, and you'll be able to make your pancake batter. And I'll have all of the details about that in the written recipe. But for now, this goes into the pantry. And one thing I do want to mention before I put this in the pantry, what I like to do is label what this mix is, and then I'll often attach the recipe for how to use it. So when you're over at my website, you can print out the recipe for how to use this in terms of adding the milk and the eggs, so on and so forth. And you can print it out and then scotch tape it to the jar or right inside your pantry door, whatever works best for you. But be sure to label your mix so that you don't get mixed up. To make our healthy make-ahead cornbread mix, what you're going to need is 4 cups of cornmeal, and I've got a stone ground cornmeal here. Then you're going to want 3 cups of whole wheat flour and 1 cup of all-purpose flour. To this, you're going to add a 1/4 cup of baking powder. And lastly, you're going to need 2 teaspoons of salt. Now, I'm just using a fine ground sea salt. You can use any salt you have. Then, just like we did with the pancake mix, we're just going to give this a good whisk around until we get everything well mixed together and nicely incorporated. Once I get this all nicely mixed together, I'm going to start transferring it to my jar. And I've got another 1/2 gallon size canning jar here. Now I'm going to put in my silica dry pack. And these are food safe. I just want to let you know that. And then I'm going to put my lid on. And into my pantry goes the cornbread mix. And again, just like with the pancake mix, in the written recipe, I'll have all the instructions on how to turn this into cornbread. Now we're moving on to our healthy brownie make-ahead mix. And the wonderful thing about brownies is they lend themselves beautifully to whole grains and whole sugars. And that makes me really happy because if you've ever looked at a brownie recipe, they generally call for a lot of sugar, actually in comparison to how much flour you're using. So if you can use a whole sugar like a sucanat or a coconut sugar or a date sugar or a maple sugar, the nice thing is you can help at least bring back some nutrients into the brownies, some vitamins and minerals that are in those natural whole sugars or whole sweeteners. Now what you're going to need for this make-ahead mix is 2 cups of whole wheat flour and 1 cup of all-purpose flour. Now I just want to mention something about using whole wheat flour or any whole grain flour for that matter, because sometimes I get this question as to recipes. Can you use sprouted flour in place of just traditional whole grain flour, a whole grain sprouted flour? And yes, you can. For any of these recipes, whenever we've called for whole grains, you can definitely substitute with a sprouted whole grain flour. And if sprouted whole grain flour interests you, I have a video all about how to make sprouted flour, how to soak the grain, how to sprout it, how to dry it, how to grind it, and make your own sprouted flour. It's actually easier than it sounds because a lot of it is downtime on your part. But if that's something you'd like to learn, I'll be sure to put a link in the description below to that video. But getting back to our mix, we've got 2 cups of whole wheat flour, 1 cup all-purpose flour, and then we're going to need 2 teaspoons of baking powder and 1 teaspoon of salt, and just a fine ground. I'm using a sea salt like I always do. This is a fine ground sea salt, but you can use any fine ground salt you have. Now for this make-ahead mix, you're going to need 4 cups of sugar. Now, as I said, look to try to a nice whole sugar or whole sweetener. What I've got here is a dark coconut sugar. Sometimes you'll see light coconut sugar, sometimes you'll see dark coconut sugar. If you can find dark coconut sugar, that works very well in brownies or any time that you're baking with anything to do with chocolate. It gives a richer flavor, it's richer in nutrients, and the dark color works well given that the nature of what you're baking with chocolate is a dark color. Now don't worry, if you are still, as I mentioned earlier, on your journey and maybe you're just starting out at the very beginning of making the transition from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and you may have started already incorporating whole grains, but you've not started incorporating whole sugars or other whole forms of sweeteners, don't worry, you can use 4 cups of white sugar for this. Sometimes it can be helpful to do these things in stages. Get your palate, your family and friends' palates used to baked goods with whole grains, and then start moving over to transitioning from white sugar to some of your alternative sweeteners. And then last but not least, the cocoa powder. Now what I've got here is an organic cocoa powder from my local grocery store. And those of you who are Texans will recognize H-E-B. It's like the best grocery store on the planet. But in any event, cocoa powder is often sold in an 8-ounce container. And you're going to need the full 8 ounces to make this make-ahead mix. But in case you buy cocoa powder in bulk or you just happen to have a larger container, 8 ounces of cocoa powder is approximately 2 cups, just shy of 2 cups. So if you are using something that isn't just in an 8-ounce container, just measure out about 2 cups. So we're going to go ahead and put in our baking powder, and then we're going to go ahead and put in our salt. And I'm first going to just give this a little spin around just to get the 2 flours well incorporated and the salt and baking powder well incorporated before I add in the cocoa powder. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in my 8 ounces of cocoa powder. And now I'm going to incorporate all of this cocoa powder into our mix. I like to do this in stages as opposed to the other 2 mixes that I just mixed everything together in one fell swoop, because sometimes there can be little lumps and whatnot in the cocoa powder, and this way you can really see what you're doing and get it nicely incorporated with the flour. And then I like to add in the sugar last, because using this dark coconut sugar, it's quite rich. And it in itself is a little lumpy. So I'm going to add that in last and then really give it a good mix. This smells wonderful if you like chocolate. And who doesn't? Alrighty, I'm going to get this coconut sugar, and I think I'm probably going to switch to a wooden spoon for this, and I'm going to start mixing all of that in. Well, I've got that sugar mixed in well, and now we'll get ready to bottle it up. And I've got another canning jar here, a ½ gallon size. This should all fit in here. And I'll just start scooping that in. And now my silica gel pack, kind of right down the middle there, my lid on, and now this is ready to go in the pantry. And in the written recipe, I'll have all the directions about adding the butter and the eggs and so on and so forth to turn this into brownies. And I also want to mention, in the written recipe, I will tell you how many batches of brownies, pancakes, so on and so forth, cornbread, that you can get out of these mixes. Because you're going to use, for example, to make the brownies, about 2 cups of the brownie mix per batch of brownies. So you'll easily get 4 batches of brownies out of this mix. And keep in mind, you can double this, triple this, quadruple this, whatever, make as many jars as you want, or in larger jars. So you can make as much as you think that you'll need over a 6-month period. Well, I think everyone loves biscuits. The only drawback is they're usually made from all white flour, all-purpose flour, plain flour, and so they're really void of nutrition. But what's great about this mix is that I've found the right combination of whole wheat flour and all-purpose flour that still creates a nice biscuit. However, we bring in some nutrition thanks to the whole wheat flour. Now, I'm just using regular whole wheat flour, but if in your travels you come across whole wheat pastry flour, which creates even a lighter baked good, be sure to try that in this mix. So for this healthy biscuit make-ahead mix, you're going to need 4 cups of whole wheat flour and 2 cups of all-purpose flour. Next, you're going to need some type of dry sweetener. And I'm using sucanat, but you can definitely use anything else you have, the maple sugar, the date sugar, the coconut sugar, whatever you like. And if you're at the beginning of your journey from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and all you have at this point is white sugar, you can definitely use that. And you're going to need 1/3 cup of the sugar. Next, you're going to want 1/4 cup of baking powder, and then 1 teaspoon of a fine salt, a fine ground salt. I'm just using a fine ground sea salt. Again, like with all the others, use whatever you have on hand. So I'm going to go ahead and mix in this baking powder and this salt, and then I'm just going to give this all a good twizzle around to completely incorporate. Then I'm going to add in the sugar. Sometimes sucanat, like some of your other whole sweeteners, can be a little on the chunky side. So what I'm going to do is just make sure I get all of this incorporated first, and then I'm going to add the sugar. You can add it through like a mesh strainer. I'm just going to break up, it's such a small amount that I'm just going to break up any little lumps with my hands. This isn't too lumpy. Just a few little lumps in there. Alrighty, now I'm going to go ahead and add in that sugar, and I'm going to go ahead and mix that in now. And now we'll go ahead and decant this one up as well. And something I want to mention to you about these half-gallon jars, these work very well for these mixes, because technically, yes, they hold 8 cups. However, the 8-cup mark is right here. So if you're making one of these mixes like we did with the brownie mix, and you're actually closer to 9 cups of total ingredients, that's okay, because you can come right up to here. You still have plenty of room. So these work very well. And in goes my silica gel pack now, lid on, ready for my pantry. And in the written recipe, I'll tell you exactly how to use this mix to make some wonderfully delicious homemade biscuits. Well, if you just want to make one healthy make-ahead mix, this is the mix for you. This is an all-purpose baking mix. It's very similar to Bisquick, but this is a healthy version. If you're new to the idea of Bisquick or an all-purpose baking mix, it is exactly as the name implies. You can use it to bake a lot of things. You can use it to make pancakes, of course, and you can use it to make waffles, but you can also use it to make muffins and coffee cakes and quick breads. There's so much that you can do with an all-purpose baking mix. And in the written recipe, I'll include some ideas for what you can make with this. To begin with, you're going to need 5 cups of whole wheat flour, and then you're going to need 1 cup of all-purpose flour. To this, you want to add 3½ tablespoons of baking powder, and you're going to need 1 tablespoon of salt, and this is just a fine ground sea salt, but again, as I've said before, use whatever you have. Next, you're going to need 1 cup of powdered milk, and this is a non-fat powdered milk. And I'm using non-fat powdered milk because that helps extend the shelf life of this mix. You can also use a whole milk powdered milk, but because that has the fat in it, and even though it's dried, it still is a fat, it doesn't have the same shelf life as the non-fat powdered milk. So rather than this having a shelf life of about 6 months, you'd push it back to maybe only about 3 months. So I recommend in these make-ahead mixes using non-fat powdered milk. So we'll get our non-fat powdered milk in the mix, and before I add the sugar, I'm just going to give this all a mix because I am using a whole sugar, and that can sometimes be a little lumpy. So you can put that through a mesh strainer, or this is such a small amount that we're going to be adding to this, we can just break up any lumps like we did before with our hands. Next, you're going to need 1/4 cup of some type of dried sweetener. And for this, I find sucanat works very well. But again, like with the others, you can use date sugar, maple sugar, coconut sugar, you know, whatever you have. And if you're, like I've said in the past, at the beginning of your traditional foods journey, you can certainly use white sugar. And you just need 1/4 cup. Now we'll just give this a good whisk around to incorporate all that sugar. Not all that sugar, we're lucky it's only 1/4 cup of sugar. Well, I've got this all jarred up. I'm going to put in my food safe silica gel pack, and that's ready for the pantry. Now, if you would like to learn how to make more homemade mixes, like a homemade cream of soup mix, spice mixes, homemade salad dressings, how to make your own bouillon powder, all sorts of things, be sure to click on this playlist over here, and I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.